welcome to the Petey Performance Podcast. I thought we'd be doing this conversation over coffee, but it's a little late for coffee at the moment. So how has the day been for you? It's been quite a long one, you've said.
Yeah, I'm 3 coffees deep at the moment. There's definitely a time that I have for a cutoff, and yeah, definitely not going to consume any more today. But it has been a long one, yeah. And yeah, nice to chat for yourself, and thanks for having me on.
100%. Been looking forward to it for quite a while. It's an interesting one when you sit down with a fellow podcaster. It's not something that I've done loads, but I think it'll hopefully be a useful experience for both of us, because I find that podcasting helps you to organize your thoughts a little bit. And then it obviously helps from a public speaking and a speaking perspective too. So how have you found podcasting? We're just talking there about your own podcast. How have you found it, and what have been the key learnings for you over that whole process? You've been doing that for a couple of years now.
Yeah, I've been doing it since December 2020, and I'd have to agree with you. Like, it does help you organize your thoughts, and I think it's like constant exposure to something that is enabling you to see a bit of adversity, to be honest, because if you're a very self-critical individual, and I definitely am, then I don't really go away from any experience where I'm like, that went perfect. And so you're giving yourself a platform to assess, reassess, and go, oh, that went better this time, but we'll still like to tweak this. And it's much like anything. It's like sport. It's like work. You're giving an opportunity to kind of grow. And podcasting has definitely been that for me. Aside from the conversations, I just think the personal development part of it has been there every episode in some shape or form. And obviously I haven't really monitored the growth of how that's been over the last year, but people have told me they've seen the difference in myself. And so that's nice, but I probably won't take the pressure off anytime soon.
It's not something that's easily done, to take the pressure off, but I've had the same experience in that, like, people might message or be talking to you or whatnot, and they're like, well, I listened to you at the start and then I just tuned back in recently, and it's like I blinked and now you're really comfortable doing it. Whereas at the start, there's such high levels of anxiety, and it, as you said, I was just going to say, it's like sport in that repeated exposure to it, it's kind of like training, will reduce your anxiety around the performance or reduce your level of arousal. Now, we still get nervous. Like, I get nervous when I'm speaking to some guests, for sure, because you're like, wow, this is a big one. It has to go perfectly. But that's no different to when you're performing in sport as well, in that each performance matters as much as the next one, but we perceive that some are more important than others.
Yeah, just a slight adjustment in the context, even though it's the same thing, I think adds a new layer or other reason to be nervous about it. For example, I do a podcast, but this isn't my podcast, and you're going to ask me about different questions that I haven't thought probably too deeply about, but probably will after this. And so that can create nervousness all by itself, even though you would think on the outside looking in, I should be well used to this and everything should flow pretty seamlessly, but it is different in nature. And so, yeah, I think, guest can be one of those variables that will just throw you for a loop, because you recognize this might get the traction that I've been longing to get. I need to be on my best, performance, or I need to be very articulate and deliver my information so that they understand the questions. And there's just a million ways to pretty much work yourself up over it. So when the stakes are high, and you find new ways to say this might be the difference maker for you, your career, whatever it is, you can get nervous pretty easily.
It's always funny as well, though, because the ones that you interpret as being the most important aren't always the ones that are most listened to or you get the best feedback from. And then, as we just spoke about off air, like the ones that you are comfortable with and you're just like, right, I'm just gonna be myself, do my own thing, be relaxed and have a good conversation, those ones sometimes absolutely fly up the charts, and you're like, wow, maybe I should try and do that more often. But it's not one or the other. Sometimes the ones that you appraise to being really valuable and really important, and you try really hard, you get a decent outcome out of that, or a decent return in terms of the amount of listens and the amount of engagement, but not always. And in a way, that's similar to, like, levels of readiness going into competition, isn't it? In that, like, sometimes when you're not feeling great, you're like, right, well, I'm just gonna try my best here and see what happens, and it goes well. And sometimes you might do that and it might not go well at all.
That's so true. Actually, I've said this often to my friends, is they, will look at key performance indicators or levels of readiness and go, oh, I did a PB 10 days out from my competition, so that's what I've got to look for from here on out. And I can say, at least to myself, that I've been doing sport long enough that I've probably had a personal best off the back of the worst, the best, and the most in between at preparation. And so I think that's a good kind of test to myself, is say, I don't need to rely on any, let's say, preconditions in order for me to be ready, so to speak. Obviously, there are components you don't want to neglect and get complacent on, but all the same, it's like there's no secret formula for when it's just going to hit home on a certain day. And I think an awful lot of the time with receptivity to listeners, it depends on what they're going through in their day-to-day lives. I've had an awful lot of athletes come to me about the sports psychology side of things because, well, that's something they're experiencing, battling with every day. When it comes to S&C, there's a certain audience that are going to appeal to that more so. So it depends on who, like, again, your listenership is, and what they are generally exposed to every day, and what's going to essentially connect the dots for experiences they've had, I think.
Absolutely. And it's interesting in a way that, like, on one hand, you're probably told to niche down and go into that niche and just have conversations around that. But in a way, by doing that, you're probably giving your listeners a little bit of a disservice, in that you're not exposing them to thoughts from people of different backgrounds and different perspectives and different thought patterns. Like, having conversations with sports psychologists versus nutritionists versus athletes in rugby, in athletics like yourself, in football, in GAA, from England, from Ireland, from Australia, all over, you get a variance in terms of perspectives. And that is what allows you to improve and grow, because you pick something different from everybody. And that's why podcasting is great in terms of networking and connecting with others, as well as you alluded to earlier, the self-development aspect, because when you leave every conversation, you're taking at least one thing, if not more, from that conversation, and you can try and implement it into your own life, training, etc. after that.
When I look back at the why of starting a podcast, particularly in track and field, I thought, what is going to make mine a little bit different to other people? And I think I've been a track and field or athletics nerd, and I'm going to say track and field, athletics interchangeably. So apologies to the listeners, a bit of the American twang still left there. Although you could argue it is, track and field. But for me, I was like, I'm connected to the US scene, or know of US coaches. I know of Australian coaches, I know of French coaches. I know of, people from all around the world. And what I found was there was varying philosophies or takes on how someone should train, how we approach competition in Europe versus the US. It's very different. I wanted someone in the NCAA, the national, the collegiate system in America, to hear from a French person that they never heard of, because I thought there was value in that. Likewise, I wanted the French person or the Australian, sports psychologist to hear from a practicing American one. Again, a way for me to get them outside of their circles and pick information, as you just alluded to, so that they can grow and adopt things that meet their needs or their situations that make sense. Because if you're always hearing the same voices, or you're creating that echo chamber, then you're not really diversifying your methods. You're not diversifying how you approach situations, etc. So I think there's a mutual kind of component between what we're learning from our podcast journeys, but the rationale behind doing it is so that the listeners actually get a diverse set of perspectives. And I think that's when I think about why I thought I could have the guts to be an athlete doing a coaching based podcast. That's what I felt like I could actually do. I could source people that I know people in America hadn't heard of, because I was kind of just a geek in general, and I felt equipped enough to facilitate, not be the coach per se.
Absolutely. That's what you improve upon the most, I think, is facilitating the conversation and directing it in the direction that you want it to go in, I suppose. But just touching on you being in the States and your why behind it, was there any point of interest for the listenership out there that really stood out for them in terms of they came back to you with feedback that, wow, I never thought about it that way? Or not just from the podcast, was there any aspect of your own coaching and your own training and your own philosophy around track and field athletics that they kind of just couldn't fathom initially, but after they looked at it through your eyes, they were like, wow, that's actually really, really smart. It's bright. I'm going to change what I'm doing slightly to incorporate that into it.
I got definitely feedback from many different American coaches stating that perspectives of a sports psychologist were particularly helpful for how they were going to communicate with their athletes. Reason being is because sports psychology as a practice is relatively new in terms of its presence in the collegiate system. So I think people are raw with their understanding of that and how it could actually be utilized by a coach. So I felt that was pretty common. On top of that, I think many collegiate coaches are fairly unfamiliar with the like club / professional scene in Europe. In the US, like it's collegiate to professional, and there's really no in between. So oftentimes when I had conversations about people saying I'm still competing yet I'm not affiliated with a university, they were like, they either didn't understand or they were saying you're going to the Olympics. There was no in between. There was like, how are you still doing this? And so I think that's kind of been spread around the podcast, talking about competitions and so forth. And I think Americans have a better understanding through listening to my European guests a little bit how organizationally things are run, and how they could essentially like bridge the gap a little bit more as well. But I think the sports psychology from the coaching or practitioner standpoint is something I got multiple times, is that we didn't really like look at it this way, keep getting those guests on. That's why I've had probably 3 or 4 of those on, because I feel like athletes and coaches are kind of like, wow, like we haven't really looked at the specificity of the mental side, so to speak, and where it can be applied.
Yeah, absolutely. And from feedback from my own athletes as well, from the few interactions we've had with sports psychologists or performance coaches over the course of this season, it's been transformative in a way that like they think about their performance a lot differently. Because if you were to ask anybody playing a high level sport or a sport at a high level, how much of your performance is physical and how much is mental, they would appraise that significantly more is psychological than the physical, than what they give to it in terms of time in their training. And it's just commonly neglected, and it's such a point that you can improve so quickly at once you do the right things and you speak to the right people. And the right person for a group or for an athlete might not be the right person for everybody, but it's about finding the right person and the right, or the person with the right message for you. That you might listen to a conversation with a sports psychologist and take very little from it, but likewise you could listen to another one and they could completely resonate with you and apply to your situation. So that's the benefit, I suppose, to getting that broadcast, that wide range of perspectives, is you get exposure to all these different people, and then you can figure out what works for you. But when you go back to speaking about the American system, what would be your own perspectives around that missing ingredient of the club system over there? Is that something that they miss a trick with, or would it work in an American setting?
Yeah, that's a really like multifaceted question. I think what I've noticed is there's quite a good setup, at least not necessarily on the club scene, but if you're a distance runner who's at a pretty high level, let's say, running 4 minutes for the mile, there's a good amount of opportunities for you to continue track after a college career. Now, if you get the equivalent in long jump, 8 meters per se, there's nothing. Even though you're as good, I guess, opportunities to compete as an elite long jumper, you're either jumping 830 or above. And that is because we don't have street meets for long jump in abundance the same way we have road miles. People don't understand what an 8 meter long jump is, but they understand what a 4 meter or a 4 minute mile is, because you know, if a Joe Soap going out and ran 7:30 and they hear someone can run 4 minutes, they're like, damn, he's fast. So it depends on the event. As far as why the club scene doesn't extend into that, that is a very deep thing that I couldn't even begin to say why more 760 long jumpers which is a pretty good level, don't continue on. It's a mentality as well, in the sense that they feel like they've just got to go and work now. But I work too. I work full time and train full time. That's what I say to people. And so, you know, there's no real barrier to that. I also don't have a coach monitoring me to the same degree as I did when I was a collegiate athlete. So I have the absence of that resource now. I did when I just moved back 2 months ago. But the point being, like, there aren't really things stopping people as such. There's just a common, I guess, societal norm that college days are up. Off you go. Because what I'm receiving here isn't that much more, if anything, than what I had back in the US. So I don't really know exactly where that would become more normalized. But I'll say this: the chances of me representing Ireland are much greater than, you know, even with the level that I'm at. And if I make small incremental gains, are much greater than an American making the US nationals team. And if that's what we're all chasing, and you're of that level, then yeah, you're probably never going to wear an American vest. And so that aspiration is definitely a common denominator amongst a lot of people, and it takes a lot more to accomplish that in America than it does here.
I was going to suggest that the major barriers will be societal, and there are clear differences between the cultures, obviously in the States and here, as well as differences in terms of life stages at different chronological ages. So they can transition into a marriage straight out of college, you know. So, and then kids straight off the bat. So where we have the luxury that we could train over here, they might not have that. But at the same time, I'm interested, and I struggle to understand how there can be such a clear cutoff of such a huge part of their life. And then what does it go into? Do they transition into other sports typically, or do they just start running road races, doing triathlons, or just training for the sake of it? Or maybe some of them just stop training altogether.
Where do they go?
But that's worrying, I think, because even from listening to Brian O'Driscoll and Rishi Sadlier were on the late a couple of weeks ago, and they had a documentary on the weekend around dropout and retirement from sport and how difficult that is. When you're retiring at the age of 23, 24, 25, and you're still fit and healthy, and as you said, you can still compete. I would imagine that there's a feeling, in a sense, that, geez, I'm wasting time here, and I'm wasting talent that I have, and wasting what I could do with my body in a way. So that's why I'm interested to ask, like, would it fit into society over there slightly? Obviously, with the slightly different cultural aspect, it would be more difficult. And what happens to these athletes when they do finish college?
And if I strip back to like my core motivation of doing it, and I would say I put many other Irish athletes in this category, is that we're doing it for mastery. We're not, we all want recognition. I would definitely get motivated about being on the top of a podium or wearing an Irish vest, sure. But it's definitely the process of like seeing how far you can get, because you don't really know. And that's a great kind of incentive to challenge yourself. And I don't know why that isn't necessarily put on them, maybe at a young age. Is it because winning and trophies and all this extrinsic form of motivation is so heavily weighed on them that the idea of pursuing something for the purity is not even an entertaining factor when they leave college? Like, I don't know. And it is a strange thing, because it's not endorsed, obviously. And does that play a role in the psychology that's taught to them early? I'm not sure. But what I will say is, when I look at the Irish athletics community, I see athletes that are really in it to test themselves, to see how far they can go. And it's not because they're receiving a ton of support.
They're not.
So it is, you know, managing the expectations that they put on themselves alongside a multitude of other responsibilities, albeit not kids and a family, like you might have suggested about the US. And that's very true what you said, and that's why I kind of reacted in that way. But it is a question to say it is a societal thing, and maybe it roots from just endorsing the more intrinsic forms of motivation. And so that, again, this idea of mastery that they could then take on board or continue, wouldn't say take on board, thereafter their college career is just it's not even an idea. And it seems almost silly to do that. Why would you do it without getting a form of, reward or recognition that is, quantified by a US vest or whatever the pinnacle is?
But I think that is an aspect that at times has been a point of contention with Irish athletes going over there. And I wanted to ask you about, obviously we've talked about cultural differences in society, but there are clear cultural differences within the university setting. So was that a bit of a culture shock for you going over, or what was the most head scratching aspect of that when you went over that you had to assimilate into eventually, or maybe you couldn't assimilate into it at all?
This took me a few months to realize after the fact. And I think the great thing that helped me realize it was the difference between my second semester and my first semester. So first semester, I went over there in January. Typically people go in September. And that was because my paperwork of transferring and stuff, a lot of documentation was delayed. So I go over there, do my whole winter training in Ireland, and indoor track and field season runs from January to March. So I get there in January and I'm competing pretty much off the bat. I come in there, my training load is different. My technical model is being played with immediately, not to like suggest that my coach did it wrong. I don't think he did at all, actually. But I had 2 years there, not much time. But I'm acclimating.
So it's about marginal gain. Small percentage.
100%. And he was looking long term, which you'd argue some American coaches won't do. They will look at, okay, he's already at this level. Why would we tinker with that? He's going to get us points and return on investment. So I actually praise him for looking at the bigger picture. And it did work out years later. But it's funny because the cultural thing was not even a thought in my mind. I'm like, I'm coming here to get better. I'm going to compete. I'm going to train out of all the resources. I'm going to be good. And I think going from Dublin, which I was a former DCU student, and having tons of friends around me, great social life, and not just social life because we're out, acting the Ginnet or whatever, just like like-minded people having the banter often to
sitting on a couch.
Yeah, just talking whatever, talking shop. And then you go somewhere where you're living in a dorm, isolated, and I was in a relationship at the time. And so you're managing all these like different things. And then I'm 23 at the time. I'm a lot more immature, and I didn't communicate the struggles as they were happening because I was just waiting for that one breakthrough. I didn't even go to my coach, who was doing all the best he could to kind of acclimate me, to talk about what I was going through. I didn't talk to people at home. So I think it took that first semester to synthesize in terms of, or not even synthesize, but to process that. And then over the summer, when I came home for like between June and August, it synthesized training. I actually sat down with my coach and said, here, this is what I think we need to do. We need to lighten the load a little bit. Body started to react better, had a few good results. And then in the midst of that process, I helped my coach recruit another Irish guy, Sam Healy, who's now my roommate in Dublin. And so great to have him over then in September. He came on board, and that kind of changed everything. We had another Israeli guy join the team, so another European, and a guy on campus who would kind of sit with us at the cafeteria, who just ended up being more like us. He was kind of an outcast, I would say. And we ended up having this like kind of good friend group that allowed us to mingle in with the newcomers on the team. Because when I got there initially, there was a bunch of seniors, final years, that I didn't really click with all that much, and we didn't see eye to eye on terms of our approach to training. So ultimately, like that first semester, I see it as a kind of readjustment to the cultural norms, to not being around the banter. And what happens with a person like me is that I'm analytical, so you need to dose me in with a little bit of nonsense. You need to put me in with, talking to friends that are, like to talk about other things as well. And so it wasn't conducive to me being at my best. And it took the second semester to see the difference and realizing that, yeah, I struggled in that first one big time.
And your unwillingness to identify, I wouldn't even say speak about the problems that you were having or the struggles, to use your own term. You were probably a little bit in denial that there were even struggles, because you were saying, no, look, sure, I have all these resources at my disposal. I can't be guilty.
This is what the US was supposed to give me.
This is what I came from.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, 100%, because I had all these primary, I guess, things that I associated with the system that were tangible. And I could realize, yep, you know, I have access to physio. I have track all the time. I have less worries about doing a part-time job. Things that were on my plate beforehand were no longer on my plate. But I don't know if you can ever quantify just how much moving country and not having friends around you, and then again adding that changing of training load and technical changes into the mix, how that can really offset, you know, your performance. And I think, again, time told me that it was not, it took a long time for me to adjust to that.
It sounds like the culture over there, and in relation to training, it's a lot more streamlined and intense, and this is the be all and end all, and this is everything. And like, that probably works for some athletes better than it works for others. Did it make you more grateful for what you had here in Ireland, and attribute like how beneficial that was to your own development when you were in DCU? And then you probably were lucky in a way that the second semester was so different that you realized, wow, this is actually what I need here now. And it's kind of set up a lot better than what my first semester was.
They were definitely contrasting. And I actually think that idea that you're talking about there is something I'm constantly learning. I don't necessarily say I have that figured out, but I'll say that a large degree of absence in any one of those domains is going to hurt me. And so shutting myself off from socializing will definitely not help. So going all in, so to speak, you know, people will talk about rest and recovery. You know, I've been sitting on my couch and lying down resting, but my mind is racing. So I need to go and have hobbies or things that I like to do in order to distract me. That isn't intense exercise, but it does create an idea for the fact that you being integrated in other things and having another identity, which is something that full-time work thankfully has given me, that allows me to manage all the things that you do need to regarding being an athlete, but have space for other that will actually support the training. Not, you know, it's not an excuse for me to just say, I'm going to go off and do XYZ at any given time. And sometimes I do that, but like, ultimately, you know, you have to have outlets to switch off, because I'm the type who's biased towards, again, putting pressure on myself, analyzing situations. The funny thing is about when I've worked now, I'll go have a training session, bad or good. My problem isn't that I'm going to reflect on it at all. It's going to be whether I'll over reflect on it. And obviously that's got a lot better since the time I'm talking to you about initially getting there, and what I know matters and what doesn't. But ultimately, I have a student in front of me who needs my help. That's what it is now. That's where my focus is. So that's been a great piece to starting working and helping other people, is that I can't spend endless amounts of time. And likewise, I can't spend endless amounts of time, or don't allow myself to spend endless amounts of time lying on the couch recovering when I could be out in one kind of folk, drinking a coffee, meeting yourself. So, exactly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, good coffee there as well. Like, give a shout out there.
Oh,
I might get a sponsorship deal as well, although I highly doubt that. But just from what you said there, it sounds like you were putting more weight on the importance of individual training sessions and your own athletic performance in that first semester than you would now, if that makes sense. And that would be why you were over analyzing it a little bit, because naturally you've moved the whole way across the world to do that. But it sounds like when you put less weight on it, you get more out of yourself.
Yeah.
So would you it's kind of similar style or similar area. When you go into a competition, would you say that you benefit more from high levels of arousal or low levels of arousal? Would you be termed a warrior or a worrier? And maybe it differs from how you perform in training. Maybe you perform in training better with a different level of arousal.
It definitely differs. I have to, not only before I answer your question, I laughed there because you talked about placing weight on individual training sessions.
Yeah.
I would say, and you said, oh, you didn't do that here. I would say just even from last year and to me moving back now, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
4 years older.
Yeah.
I even see that now, because when you're in an environment that's 30 degree weather all the time, you have 4 long jump pits to choose from. I can make any day I want basically a good day.
Mm-hmm.
And a big constraint that I didn't leverage last year was using, let's say, less than ideal conditions to build a more stable technical model. Something I've talked about with a recent podcast guest of mine, both on the physical side and the mental side. And that hindered me to when I came to chaotic situations last year. So I found that I was going away from sessions very aroused by the fact that I performed really well. And the days that it didn't go well because there was a crosswind cutting across me, I was more reactive, which is not ideal at all, because the day you get that in a competition, you want to be less
able to do it.
Yeah. So I think one of the benefits I've already seen in this accumulation of 4 weeks of training back here in Ireland is that I don't get to decide what I run into at any given time. And there's a beauty in that. And I think that is going to enable me to become content with whatever I'm given. And I have shown that to myself in various different times that I'm capable of doing that, but there's a level of exposure that kind of sets you up to be that way. It's not that I'm naturally a worrier or a warrior. There's times where I've, even when I didn't think much about the sport, like I've been a centimeter behind in the last round in an Irish schools championship. This is how I won my first gold medal. I was winning the whole competition. A guy overtook me, the jumper before me, by a centimeter, and then I overtook him by a centimeter. So I've definitely showed many times to myself, like, I can turn it on when I need to turn it on. And then I've also disappointed myself greatly when I'm very physically ready and didn't set myself up for success, for whether it was the reasons I just mentioned to you, or I overanalyzed. I would say my biggest failure in sport, and I say failure, it taught me a lot, but I think this one, it keeps me up at night a little bit more than the rest. I went to the NCAA regional championships in 2019, a dream of mine for years, so close to getting to the NCAA nationals. This is something that I dreamt about since 16 years of age, when I was, again, starting my nerd journey of the collegiate system. And suddenly I'm there. I'm like in the best shape of my life, and I'm there. And for so long, especially when you think the year before was that bad year that I had in the US, this just didn't look like it was happening. But then I'm there and I'm in great shape. And I, probably the only competition I'd say in my career that I firmly choked, and the most important one. And that's
in your terms.
In my terms, yeah. And I'm okay with saying that. Yeah. I even would say I turned that ship around the months after and learned from it. But yeah, there's been moments of supreme importance where I've performed, and there's some where I haven't. And I'll tell you that obvious component to when I've not performed really well when it was important was I overanalyzed.
Yeah.
And I would say last year's underperformance on that side, I've given you the reasons why I think that was, and I think why Ireland will help me adjust and adapt, build stability, and allow me to become a warrior more. Because a warrior means that I feel like I'm ready and I don't really give a shit, and I'm just going to get after it. And I think the more I can tap into that, the better.
What would be your advice to athletes with a similar thought process to yourself, in that they tend to overanalyze things? And off the back of that, or even prior to answering that, how are you assessing your readiness prior to competition? Is it a self-assessment, or are you basing it off of physical tests that morning, or is it how you're performing in training that week? Or right. Maybe it's a combination of all of them.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first part of your question, I'd say for overly analytical people, you know, coaches, your coach needs to kind of know that. And I think they can tailor their feedback to ensure that that happens less often. I think also they need to be willing to have discussions with you for the person that you are. And, you know, I don't necessarily think I needed a sports psychologist this past year, but it's a career that I'm interested in going into in time. But the great thing about a sports psychologist, as you mentioned, what they're doing with you isn't necessarily rocket science, but they're giving you a platform to ask yourself questions that might be holding you back. They're teaching you how to get out of your own way, same way a coach is. So I think putting great people around you who will allow you to be your authentic self and again, give you hard challenges. I think one of the reasons I came to the realization of my own reactiveness in last year is because my coach pulled me aside, you know, and said, Colm, like, you're a pretty like stable person in a lot of ways. You know, you're analytical, but you generally get on with it and you're not shaken by any one particular variable. He said, but I've noticed you definitely get shook when that wind is like cutting across you. And that wasn't really a thing last year. And I think part of that came from my over obsession with wanting to win nationals, number one. So there's a motivation behind that. So you need to get at that. What's the root of it? And why does this training session need to go perfect? And then break down, I guess, a strategy to actually making the session good enough. Don't look for the best every day. Look for what can I get out of this workout today and what would be satisfactory. And I think I realized that days when it's chaotic, work on posture, because posture tends to fluctuate a little bit when I am getting thrown by the wind. So I need to move my mark in because I'm not covering as much ground because it's not on my back. So just taking a proactive approach to it. And I think your coach has to help you facilitate that on the technical side. And I think a sports psychologist can help you facilitate it in terms of like stripping back behavioral patterns, sources of motivation and seeing what the true like kind of issue is. I'm talking about this in a very thorough basis because I'm 27 and like I've been doing this. So it really depends on what, you know, athlete you're talking about. Like what age are we talking? Are they introspective? Are they not? You're assuming that you are.
I'm talking about someone similar to yourself. Yeah. So you've answered it for yourself, which is what I was looking for out of the question, which is definitely something that will help someone, which is what I was going after, I suppose. But it's interesting, like your points there. There's always something you can work on, and it's something that I'm trying to get through to athletes in team sports mainly, because that's who I'm working with. And as well as that, probably general population, people I work with the odd time as well. Just because it's high-low model, we can still get benefits out of the low day. And it doesn't mean that the low day is going to be easy. We're still going to be challenging you. We're just going to be challenging you in different physical qualities or psychological qualities than what will challenge you on the high day. As well as that, I was laughing because I saw a video earlier that kind of applies very, very well. And it was Dan Bath working with a coach and working with an athlete, and the athlete is training, the coach is coaching, and Dan Paff pulls him to the side and he says, "What are you looking for?" And he's like, "Perfect. Doesn't exist." And it doesn't. Perfection doesn't exist. That's the whole challenge. We're chasing it, but you have to know that it doesn't exist. So you can't get tied to chasing perfection every day, because even if you do have those every session perfect and every session goes to plan, as you said, are you really challenging yourself then to the same extent as if you were failing the odd time and having a tough day at the office? Because you need those tough days and you need to challenge. I know it's Franz Bosch says you want to keep it between 30% and 70% success rate for optimal learning, I suppose, and motor learning. So, and I think that's useful across any pursuit as well. I heard on a podcast recently, somebody said, like, if you know your 8 times tables, you're not just going to do your 8 times tables all the time. Then there's no benefit in doing it. You have to move on to 9 eventually.
A lot of what you're saying there relates to, well, someone who's very close with Dan Paff, Stu McMillan.
Yeah.
Number one, he'll bring up what is optimal? We don't know what optimal is. And on top of that, he said in the podcast, which is crazy because it was a month before the nationals, and I really wish I listened and not attacked myself more, but questioned my own thought process with what he was saying when he was saying it. And that is, we're in trouble if every session is good. Yeah. I want enough adversity, and I want them to manage the process of that very well. And he was also the one who talked about the weather and other kind of chaotic conditions being a way to build the stability in the technical model. So he's talking about a multitude of psychological and technical adaptations there that are so necessary for you being ready to perform with whatever is brought to you on that like big occasion. And so, yeah, he's just, to me, when I listen to him, I'm really understanding that there's a lot I don't know, like a lot. And he just has been in the game a long time.
He's so authentic as well.
Oh, yeah.
And to bring you back to what you said about the authenticity, do you think it's easier for you to be authentic here in Ireland than it is in the States? Because this is your more natural environment by the sounds of things.
I'm going to answer one of your quick fire questions that you put on here. Yeah. And you asked me, what's the biggest lesson you've learned in 12 months? It is the importance of authenticity and vulnerability, and it will lead to your richest relationships. Now, I don't know if, and I'm not going to preach that being here means always joyful and that it was anyway the opposite in America as such. I found a way to find meaning and joy in the situation I had there. But I will agree with you in the sense that it is more of me. And funny enough, I made probably 6 months ago an active, I'd say, pursuit to bring that back, because someone who was quite close to me at one stage says, Colm, like, it seems like you've got very serious and you weren't always that way. And, you know, for the moment that it was said to me, I was like, yeah, whatever, you don't have a clue. And after the fact, I was like, no, like, it's great that I've added new layers to myself, taken on a whole nother identity. Brilliant. In fact, needed, but there's truth in that. And yes, I think Ireland does appeal to the more authentic part of me, because we do have a very, I would say, niche type of behavior and banter that, you know, it just doesn't necessarily get facilitated over in a foreign country. I had great friends in America, fantastic ones that I think if I didn't have them the last 2 years, I would have been long gone before it ended up happening. But I think there's just something uniquely different about Irish people that it does warm my heart a lot more, and I am able to get out of certain zones easier having them around. Yeah, for sure.
It might be easier to be more authentic when you feel more understood. And as you suggested there, you alluded to, like, abroad, and I've lived abroad and played abroad, and the people, there's no issue with the people. They're great people. Of course. It's just the fact that because of the nuances of our behavior and the way that we communicate, they don't understand us to the same degree. So you maybe present yourself, not that you're being inauthentic, but you can only show a certain amount of your true self, if 100%. That makes sense.
Oh, no, it's absolutely true. Because if we think about authenticity, like, there's just this fluidity to it. There's no thinking. It's like imperfect in its own way, but it's natural. And there is something to be said for when you live an X amount of years in a certain country, and then, you know, you're catapulted into a whole nother universe where there's a completely different set of norms. You know, if we make jokes around guys and stuff, we're looking for a reaction. We continue to do it because we're going to get a reaction. If you find that you're not getting the reaction you want in a different society, you don't do it. So the thing that is pretty reflexive to you doesn't really become that reflexive. And I think that just kind of happens in a multitude of ways. And as you mentioned, there are great people, and I had great people over in the US, but there's no doubt if I did what was natural, like, it wasn't going to always be met with essentially like certain positivity or encouragement the same way it would be here. And it is very nuanced thing.
I think humor is a huge part of our culture here, like massive, more so than in other countries. And I do fear sometimes in the age of social media where sometimes influences from the States can impact a little bit more on society. And I do see from time to time this 100% all-in culture of like go, 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 and the Navy SEAL type mentality creeping into different parts of social media. Probably I'm more exposed to it because I'm a strength and conditioning coach and I see that aspect of social media.
Yeah.
And I think I went down that rabbit hole, and I probably fall into the trap of doing so the odd time, even occasionally now. But now when I see it, I'm able to see it through eyes, like clear eyes, I suppose, in that I saw a post during the week about like time management and you're not actually working hard. Like you've this amount of hours, what are you doing with this amount of hours? You could be doing this amount of reading and this amount of studying and this amount of sleeping and then this amount of training. And I just looked at it, and in the past I would have looked at it and said like, yeah, 100% definitely. None of you are working hard. But then I looked at it as like, where in this 24 hours are you meeting another person and interacting with them? There's no scope for connection or actual switching off time and relaxation and rest and recovery. And you do the work, be that the studying, the training, the self-development, you do that with a view that the recovery is what makes you retain it and actually cause the adaptation. So if you leave no room for that, then you're not going to improve. And I think in Ireland, we kind of inadvertently get that right in a sense, in that the way that club structure and sporting structure and society in general around work is set up, there are more opportunities for interactions outside of the serious time, if that makes sense. Like if I just throw you back to your time in DCU, and I know it was similar to my time as an like, well, if you can call rugby being an athlete, post training there's always something going on, whether you're going for a coffee or in the rugby case going for a drink or going for to go to someone's apartment and have some food or whatnot. And likewise in Dublin, like it or not, or for a good thing or a bad thing, there's always an opportunity after work to go out with someone for a drink or a meal. And at lunchtimes there's always time to go for a coffee, whereas it might not be that way in the States to the same extent.
Not where I was, at least. And it's funny, things definitely changed for me when I got a car, because you kind of need one over there. My first 3 years I didn't, and that was not great because everything was very limited in what I could do. But even still, like, you're talking about Dublin, 1 million people, endless amounts of places to go. And we as athletes in DC used to go to Aussie Barbecue. Don't know if you ever remember Aussie Barbecue. It was bloody brilliant at the time. And it was our kind of hangout. Like, that's what we used to do instead of feeding ourselves a pint, to just throw a pound of a burger in there instead. But yeah, it's just like, it depends on what side you sit on. I know people that are very disciplined and can be almost drill sergeants in terms of how they approach life, and performance does not suffer. In fact, it is amplified by that. But if you are someone who, let's say, is a bit more on the extroverted side, you have more of a social battery, then there's a case to be made that satisfying that is pretty important. And then couple that with the fact that you might be analytical. If you're neglecting the social aspect and you're going, quote unquote, all in, that's going to be detrimental. And I don't know about you, and in terms of when you held that mindset, did you find that you would get burnt out easier? Because when I feel like I'm doing everything right for long periods of time, yeah, sure, it feels great in the beginning, but over time, the amount of stimuli that I'm getting is not, I can't handle it personally.
And it's not what you need. You do better at that stage by doing less, not by doing more, even though our nature is, if you are overly analytical and self-critical, is to always do more.
Sure.
And it's interesting that you bring up burnout, because that was the topic of this week's podcast, and was burnout. And I talked about my own experiences with burnout, and I have a unique kind of perspective on it, because whenever I've been burnt out, be that as an athlete or as a coach, I've only realized that I'm burnt out when somebody has told me I'm burnt out.
Really?
I'm not able to figure it out for myself and like be that way self-analytical and say, geez, I'm not feeling the best here. Why is that? This isn't going to plan. Geez, I'm dropping the ball on a few things that I wouldn't usually do. But I always meet that with, geez, I need to try harder or do more. But sometimes you need somebody to pull you back in and say, like, geez, it sounds like you might be burnt out. And then initially you'd be like, no, I'm fine. But then after a while, you'd be like, geez, maybe I am. And then that's when you take the foot off the pedal and maybe relax a little bit because it's needed. But I've always struggled to identify when that's happening. And Josh Fletcher, who I had on, he said burnout is different for different people, and it's either a creep or a bang. Sometimes it creeps up on you, or sometimes it just happens all of a sudden. And I've definitely experienced the creep. I don't think I've experienced the bang. I maybe have experienced the bang in relation to sports performance, in that it's hit me like a brick, like, because I haven't been able to do the things on the field that I would usually be able to do and would expect myself to be able to do. But I think even when that has happened, it's probably crept up to that point, and that's just been the point when I've realized it, if that makes sense.
It's like overuse injuries.
Yeah,
we
exactly.
think that it's the moment, but it's really not.
Exactly.
It's usually something that's accumulating. Brad Stulberg, who wrote The Practice of Groundedness, he mentions the component there, that community, and it's something that you don't think matters for sustained success. In America, that took a different form, because you know what community is in Monroe, Louisiana? Church.
Yeah.
People go and forget what they do day in, day out at church. They meet other people, talk more about family things or nonsense in their terms. And we kind of do that in a different way in Ireland. And all the same, think about your nervous system and the sympathetic, parasympathetic. It's just getting away from, the stress.
Yeah.
And that can look different for many different societies. We know that probably coupling with more inflammatory material is not great, but at the same time, there's obviously, as we say, a balance.
Yeah.
And it looks different in different places. And I just think, constant neglect of that component can lead you down a scary road. And it's one that, I think it's not often talked about.
No, and I know people do give out as well, and we're alluding to the inflammatory aspect of alcohol, obviously.
Yeah.
And they say there's nothing to do but drink. I think Dublin is changing in a way that there are more things to do than drink, for sure. And it is improving, and I think it will continue to improve. And it's only going to be to the benefit of our generation and younger, I suppose. Society as a whole, whether it's going to impact that much on older generations who are already maybe set in their ways to a certain extent, you would question, but at least it's available as a resource, I guess. And that is one of the things I wanted to ask you, like, what did you miss the most about Ireland in terms of resources, and what has been making the biggest difference for you in returning to Ireland and your own training and performance, be that in athletics or track and field, as you said, or from a professional standpoint too?
Well, I have to allow for room the fact that I'll probably realize this in a few months down the line.
Yeah.
I can definitely tell you that since coming back, like say the first 3 weeks compared to now, getting settled in Dublin and having the work that I have here, which is obviously brilliant. And when we bumped into each other, like, one kind of folk, but it was the first time I'd been there. And I think for me, a common, let's say, mainstay in what I do when I travel anywhere is I suss out the best coffee shops. That was my first time one kind of folk. I'd actually gone to 2 others that day as well that I had never been to. So that's like the hobby for me. So I've definitely enjoyed that, being back in Dublin. That was what I did when I was in DCU. I would go myself and just, roam around, try tick off the box. And if I liked a place, I continue to go back. And that's kind of my form of relaxation for the most part. But I'd say that from the training standpoint, it is actually, as you mentioned earlier, I think will be not only the lack of focus on singular sessions that are going to make, but it's just allowing myself to kind of allow the work to compound, which I would say I did last year. I mean, I compounded some absolutely fantastic work. And I was going through a new program that was, to a certain extent, in its experimental stages. And we found out a lot of good information off that. So we could be looking at 6 months down the line after, some success, that it was, due to me being home in Ireland. But you could also say, yeah, but you were in a different coach last year. So there's an adaptation that takes time, as I learned from my first year to America to the second, getting reacclimated and your body's changing all the time. So I think we revisited enough things during the off season to say, this needs to be more integrated. What I'm specifically talking about, like the low days, you had mentioned them with your athletes. Probably in season, we got too far away from low days being like active recovery and more on complete rest. So my body was quite offloaded. Again, experimentary, because realistically, I'm older now. I've done a ton of aerobic work over the years. I'm very aerobically fit naturally. And there's a case to be made that I don't need that anymore. I think I do, especially from like the general strength circuits and stuff like that. So we revisited that, and I think that'll be helpful on top of maybe some of the rabbit holes we went down on the strength side of things. So there's like a lot of little variables that I'm looking forward to tightening up training wise, and adding, subtracting, and not so much experimenting, but more solidifying. And then coupled with a greater life balance, being able to tap into more of what I like on the weekend and having the social circle around me. Yes, I don't have the luxury of walking out of the track on any given day and hammering some 20-meter flies, but that's why I position myself in Santry, so I have indoor facilities close by. The only reason, and I said this to myself, was I would come home if it was in Dublin. And the funny thing is, I was at home visiting. I don't think I told you this. I was visiting for 3 weeks, see my family. Hadn't seen them in 2.5 years. And I'm going home from Cork. I'd just done a competition down there. And I was browsing through LinkedIn, and I saw this job posting come up. A day later, I messaged the hiring manager on LinkedIn. A day later, she comes back to me. Long story short, that was a Thursday. The job is on offer on Tuesday. I'm set to fly back to the US on Friday. So all in that instance, I had to make a decision. And to be honest with you, I was coming off a season where I'd done great work. I felt like I'd smashed every physical metric that I set for myself in the beginning of the season. I even power cleaned. You had mentioned, like, how do you assess your readiness before nationals? I power cleaned 135 kilos 10 days before nationals at 79 kilo body weight. I was as strong as an ox, but didn't perform as well as I wanted at nationals. Talked about the chaotic conditions that I didn't adapt to, etc. So performance is complex. We know that, but like, I think it's it was a decision that I made based on not being in a place for athletics alone anymore. And I felt like for the majority of my time in Monroe, I was there for athletics. Yeah. And it's not that I was willing to sacrifice it all. I felt like I had a good enough setup in Dublin. And there was a lot to be said. My performances were pretty good in Dublin the years I was in DCU. And so it didn't really all make sense in terms of why this season, the past season, was not as good as it should have been. And there might be a multitude of reasons for that that'll reveal themselves. But what I do know is happy to be home, seeing the people, like my family often, my brother particularly, who lives down here as well. And just, not focusing on one session at a time, making it perfect, and just being content to do what's right and still get my massage on the weekend, still sleeping good, still hydrating. I bring my food with me every day. I've got the cornerstones, so to speak, in place. It's not complicated. And thankfully I have a work situation that facilitates me working at home 3 days a week. So it's not like I'm telling people like to just not put that structure around you to be successful or balance the two. I'm absolutely an advocate for that. But there is an extent for me that I took it to and have taken it to where it becomes, I would say, potentially detrimental. Yeah.
We've touched on it earlier in that a lot of high profile Irish athletes have went to the States and done well and succeeded in both the collegiate and professional environment over there. And some have went over and not enjoyed it to the same extent and came home. What would be your advice to athletes who are thinking about doing that at the moment, be they going into college, in college currently, or even looking at it from a professional standpoint too? Who does it suit and who does it not?
That's a very good question. I'm actually pretty lucky, and I don't know how this has got around the athletic circle in Ireland. I get asked this by prospective athletes all the time. Some random Irish athlete will jump into my Instagram DMs and go, I heard you're the guy to ask about all this stuff. And to be honest with you, I'm very privileged that I'd be even thought of in that manner. And I'll get on 2-hour calls explaining this to, whoever it is, and I've never even met them before. And they'll say, oh, geez, I'll pay you for that. And I'm like, I don't even want it. Like, I just kind of figured the process out on my own, in that thankfully I was 23 when I went over. And obviously I'd mentioned that I didn't handle it brilliantly when I got there. I'm being very self-critical about that. I did quite a good job, I think, in choosing a good setup. Maybe I didn't factor in the community side of it.
But how could you when you didn't know?
Correct. But you might argue that you're going from Dublin to this place with 50,000 people, maybe that matters. So my starting point for people is that if you're a city person, maybe don't go to a small town in a very conservative or, reserved place. I think that's a good, factor to consider. I would say the biggest thing that I think Irish athletes have gotten wrong, and unfortunately, this is where we hear the bad stories, is not doing enough homework on the coach's training prescription. I sat down with probably 10 coaches in terms of finding out what their winter entailed, what their in-competition preps entailed, and I compared that to what I was doing. I don't think every 18-year-old should do that, so you got to have your coach at the table to try, figure that out with you. I did it independently because I was a bit older, and so I matched it up with who was the most willing to problem solve alongside me, tell me what I was doing well, what could be improved upon, because to me that's spoke distance, and distance was my currency that I wanted to gain. And so the training setup was discussed in detail, and I just felt like, okay, I have 2 years here. I don't need a lot of, let's say, adaptation time. I did have that in the first 6 months, as I described, but I wanted to minimize that if I could. And I think a lot of the times, if I'm to give an example of something that's very extreme, someone going over, a middle distance runner who's done 50 miles a week training wise up until being a senior boy, and then jumps in a star-studded group in Oklahoma because they feel like this is where all the good athletes go. Yeah, it is, but those good athletes have done 80 miles a week up until now, and now you're doing 90 miles a week. The jump for them to get to that level of training stimulus is not huge, but it's huge for you. And that's where the breakdown tends to happen. So I look at it from a standpoint that there's usually reasons for this, and often the takes of bad experiences that you hear are from people, number one, who've never been in the system, or haven't, if they've been in the system, they didn't take the time to really look at this, the whole picture.
They saw university caliber and that was their metric. They
100%.
Oh, they do well with their athletes. 100%. I'm going there, but they didn't ask why they do well, which is the very important, or how they do it.
Yeah.
Which is probably the most important. And as well as that, the difference, I was explaining this to one athlete of mine yesterday in regards to America and here, is that they can, in certain instances, just sacrifice a few lambs to the slaughter, in that they will just throw in a large group who have really good genetics and throw volume at them and throw load at them, and whoever survives, because we have 10 more of you. So if you get injured, like, tough, sorry. Whereas here, when we have a golden nugget or somebody that's brilliant, we really have to nurture them, because there's not an abundance of people here. And especially in athletics, where we don't have huge numbers competing, especially in certain events, like you'll have very niche events. So you can't just throw volume at someone and push them really, really hard. You have to be a little bit more reactive off the base of how the athlete is responding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes even into other dynamics as well, as if the athlete that's going over to the US has constantly been, let's say, the golden child of the group, and they're used to getting all the feedback, And again, they were taken care of or mollycoddled. I don't know if you want to be in the group with 6 other alpha males if you're accustomed to is getting treated like that. That's going to take some time to get used to, and oftentimes it's a variable that's overlooked. So I talked about this. I had an episode with a guy from Right Track Sports, and they're really good at kind of breaking down all the impactful components. And I think, if anyone's listening to this thinking about going to the US system, look at it from a very broad perspective. Don't just go for the brand name. Don't just go for the place that seems attractive, that gets the biggest gear. I know it's flashy and people will love the fact that you're sending Instagrams of your big race day kit. But do you want to be, what's the motivation? Do you want to be successful? Do you want to perform? Because that can be a little bit of a bigger conversation.
The kit's only going to last you for a few years and then it'll be gone.
And if you perform shite in it, well, sure.
You won't forget about it anyway, yeah. Well, you've answered one of the quick fire questions already, but the first one is proudest achievement to date.
That's a tough one. I think there's many that kind of have equal weight to them, and it's depending on like the lead up, so to speak. I had talked about that one where I had got over, a centimeter in the final round of my first national championships to win. That was of course a big moment for me personally. But 2017 last year in DCU, I'd been injured most of the year, so it's one of those unconventional preparation periods. First serious injury where I missed long strings of training, and then summer kind of came out of nowhere, had a very good season, and ended up having some performances that actually got me the scholarship in America after several coaches, lots, shutting me down, and then got that opportunity off the back of it. So I think just with dealing with adversity during that period and keeping things in perspective was something I'm quite proud of. So different reasons, different things. There's no outlier.
Yeah, but that's good that it's not really, although there's an outcome, both of yours aren't really about the outcome. It's about like the story or the adversity that you went through to get there, if that makes sense. Which is great, because it's not always about like where you get to, it's about how you do it.
Sure.
And those make for the better stories as well. So
absolutely,
I can see why the two of those are your proudest achievements to date. Next one is favorite athlete of all time.
This is going to come as a weird one. The person who's listening to this, I hope they do listen to it. I would say my favorite athlete is actually one of my rivals. Adam McMullen quit the sport just last year. I only beat him once, and the only reason I beat him is because he was injured. So I just think, when I think of my favorite athlete, I don't really like the word.
You're undercutting yourself or underselling yourself a little bit there by saying that the only reason that you beat him is because he's injured, because it's multifactorial.
Sure. Yeah. And I've talked about multifactorial things the whole podcast, so it'd be ridiculous to deny it now. But I think just for me, I get inspired by people who I know the backstory. So similarly to how I kind of like my own achievements, I see what people go through. And for him, I knew that he was an invested athlete, someone who really got immersed in his craft. And he did great things in this event that I do in the country that I'm from. And so that to me is, if someone could raise the hairs on my arms, that's what, like quote unquote, is my favorite, like someone who can elicit that response. And he did some things that, he doesn't even know that, but he inspired me on days where I didn't want to be there in training, and I knew I was chasing him, to so to speak, and I wanted to replicate what he had done. So I'd probably say him.
That's a very interesting take, and I definitely can see why. And I respect the fact that you've chosen him as well, and I hope he does listen to this. The last one then, because you've answered the second last one. The last one is, what would you tell your 18-year-old self?
That's a good one. I'd say my roommate and I, who's the current national champion in long jump, we've joked about this. He laughs at when I tell him about my 18-year-old self. My 18-year-old self was absolutely obsessed with the sport. I used to eat raw ginger on a day-to-day basis and cottage cheese before I went to bed. neither of which I liked.
Yeah,
I wouldn't go.
I was on the cottage cheese as
Oh,
well.
Jesus. To me, miserable, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that I was not miserable at the time, but I was overly obsessed with performance. And I think this puts into perspective why I've had to deliberately make more investments in my outlets and so forth. Because when you want to look up the dictionary of intense of an 18-year-old, you would have found my face at the front of it. And my coach, who facilitated it to a degree, would always ask me why I was so intense. He just made me such. So I would say my advice to that person is to chill out and adopt other identities outside of athletics. Because for me at that time, I wouldn't even so much go for a Subway with my friends because it was bad food. You know what I'm saying? That unhealthy mindset around, good is good, bad is bad. Eat ginger, good. Eat cottage cheese, good. Pints, bad. Women, bad. Distractions, it's just very narrow-minded in terms of what I knew. I was obviously thinking of the best possible outcomes, and I was doing it for a good cause, but I needed a good shake. And among many other things, probably needed.
I can empathize with that wholeheartedly, and I think there's a powerful message in there for young athletes for sure. And I think I've reflected on this. I think it's very Irish Catholic of you to think of things as good and bad in nature. And I think, well, not so much Irish Catholic, but Irish society in general, the way it was, taught us that things were either black or white, good or bad. And I don't think it's necessarily a healthy thing. So as we go into adulthood, let us both hopefully embrace the grey a little bit more. But thanks a million for coming on, Colm. Great conversation, really enjoyed it. And hopefully we can have another conversation.
Appreciate it, Peter. Thanks for having me.